Thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks Annalise. Annalise is coming to Parliament this time round, formerly being an MEP, and as soon as we knew she was standing as a candidate in one of the seats we were to win, we were keen to recruit her to the Treasury team we've been working with for a number of years. My only anxiety is I thought we might have to pay a transfer fee to the European Parliament at one point, but there you are. So welcome, I'm really pleased. Some of you will have worked with her over the years as well. Look, what we've been doing for the last 2 years, some of you have been with us on this journey, is trying to encourage a wider debate as we possibly can on the economic issues facing our country, and then drill down from those issues into the development of policy, and in the development of policy, making sure that we link that, yes, to a fully costed programme, and then link that fully costed programme with funding sources to enable us to, well, invest in the long-term future of our economy. And that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years, and many of you have been involved in this. As Annalise has said, we've been doing lectures and seminars and conferences all around the country for nearly 2 years now. And to be frank, the attendance at them has been spectacular, absolutely spectacular. In some of the towns and cities that we've done them, all of them have been packed out, and they've been packed out with people who range from Labour Party members to local trade unionists to business leaders, representative organisations. We've involved the CBI, Chamber of Commerce and others, and sometimes, yes, a range of academics and some people who just wanted to come in and keep warm, which was fair enough. And it's been extremely successful, and it was building up a body of work in which we were developing the policies for a general election to come, and developing in particular the economic direction for our country, but as I say, the detail of policy. The work was slightly interrupted by the last general election, which wasn't down to us. And what we've been able to do since then is say to our Shadow Cabinet teams, we produced a manifesto which appeared to be extremely popular, but what we have to do now is take those individual policies, and in particular the costings and the funding processes, and make them now, turn them in from individual policies in the manifesto into implementation manuals effectively, and link to that the detail of implementation, but also draft legislation for whenever we go into government. And that could come, well, I just quote David Mellor, as a result of the anarchy within the cabinet, that could come at any time, short haul or long haul. One of the policies we put forward, and again, part of the process we've had over the last 2 years, is just freeing up people's ability to think, and sometimes to think ideas that have been contested, but certainly ideas that actually we think are productive in stimulating the debate. And one of those areas we were looking at, obviously, was how we produce a fair taxation system, and some elements of that we've drilled down in some detail and published various reports. One of the ideas we looked at, and some of you have been involved in lobbying for this policy for quite a while, is a financial transaction tax. Some time ago, we met Avinash to talk through his ideas, because we were interested in someone who just like a lobbyist like us, but someone who'd worked within this sector and knew in detail how it operated and knew how effectively you could introduce an FTT. So I was really pleased when Avinash produced his proposals, and we included them in our programme for funding our election manifesto programme. But again, it was one of those ideas that we wanted to work up in much greater detail, working with him and other experts. So it's just exciting now. We're in a period where these ideas can be properly debated and discussed, and people can fly kites sometimes, and in flying those kites, I think, create an atmosphere of creativity that may not have happened in our economic debates over recent years. So I'd like to introduce Avinash Persaud. You know he's the founder and chairman of Intelligence Capital. Prior to founding Intelligence Capital and the GAM Persaud Investment Funds, he was head of global research at State Steel Corporation. We've all got a bit of form, Avinash, haven't we, on these things as well? Avinash Persaud.
Thank you, Shadow Chancellor. Thank you, Annalise. Good afternoon, everyone. Nothing raises the hackles more of city folk than talk of a financial transaction tax. And I say that as a former banker myself. In fact, the deep opposition to the FTT from the city goes straight to the playbook of the tobacco industry. You might recall that the science of linking tobacco to lung cancer was well developed by the late 1950s. But the tobacco industry managed to obfuscate. They obfuscated by producing and sponsoring several reports, bombing the public consciousness with lots of different numbers, ideas, questions of methodology. So it wasn't until the 1980s that we got proper public policy around tobacco, until we got fiscal policy, taxes, bans, and nothing was sharper in the weapon against lung cancer, actually, than fiscal policy and raising taxes on tobacco. And that is the playbook the city is very much adopting, a very similar playbook on trying to obfuscate the issues. They will tell you that it is impossible to have a financial transaction tax if you're the only country doing it. They will tell you that were you to do it, you will raise no money whatsoever because your entire industry will move abroad. And they will tell you that even though you've raised no money, it will still lead to a ruined economy and financial sector. And I find what's actually astounding about these assertions is how they fly in the face of the actual evidence, of the facts, of the well-known, publicly available facts. I want to perhaps tell you a bit about this by giving you the briefest of histories. It was 1624, I think, when the Netherlands had a public competition trying to find the best idea of a new tax. A new tax, and the competition was come up with the best tax that would be hardest to avoid and easiest to collect. And the winner was the stamp tax. And the idea of a stamp tax is that a transaction is not legally enforceable unless it's got a stamp that taxes have been paid. So you can do the transaction, but if you haven't paid your tax, someone could turn up in court and say, you know what, he doesn't own it, I own it. And you would not be able to enforce your legal right. Now, no investor is going to take that risk. And that's why, in fact, today, 50% of this tax, ladies and gentlemen, because we currently have a tax, 50% are paid by foreigners. Isn't that the best tax? 50% are paid by non-voting foreigners because they're afraid that their ownership of British equities would be legally challenged if they didn't. Anyway, it took a few years later before the UK adopted a stamp tax, 1694, and indeed the purpose of the tax in 1694 in the UK was to finance the first Brexit, because it was to finance the war with the French, deciding whether we were going to follow the Protestant line of ascension to the throne or the Catholic one. And the stamp duty gave the English government the revenues to win that first Brexit. 323 years later, we have a stamp tax on share transactions that raises 3.3 billion pounds every year. So the notion that no one country can do it on their own, we've been doing it on our own for 323 years. And we're not alone. In the IMF's report to the G20, they pointed out there were 20 other countries that have financial transaction taxes and raise every year $30 billion. And that's quite apart from the 10 European countries that are actually considering raising a similar tax. And these 20 countries are some of the fastest growing countries in the world. India, China, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Switzerland, South Africa. So the notion that you can't do it unless you have a global agreement, and it would ruin your economy, that no one would pay it, flies in the face of facts. Now, why is the finance sector so deeply opposed to this tax? More deeply opposed than almost anything else you can propose. And I think that's because the financial sector's model has moved to a point where this tax would be very difficult for them, to be frank. And you know what? That's not a bad thing, because we need to move the financial sector to a better model. So why have they moved that way? So we tax effectively banks when they lend. It's not a tax. We require them to put capital against their lending. Capital is money that has to be available to absorb a loss. And therefore, they can't earn interest, they can't invest that capital. It's a form of tax. We don't tax them for doing transactions. So if you tax banks for lending, but you don't tax them for transactions, what do you think they're going to do? They developed a model where they do less and less direct lending and more transactions. So today, the model of banks lending to homeowners, you know what that model is. Firstly, there's an agent who finds the person who needs a mortgage. Not the bank, an agent who originates the mortgage. Goes to the bank, and that agent gets a fee. And the bank gets a fee for taking on the mortgage, and the bank gets a fee for packaging lots of mortgages together. And then the bank goes to a rating agency and pays that agency a fee for rating this package of different mortgages. And then they go to another financial intermediary and they pay him or her a fee to issue this security in the marketplace. And then an asset manager buys the security, and we pay the asset manager a fee to manage the security and to trade that security. That is the new banking model. And there are two problems with that banking model. The first one is that all these fees appear small, but they add up, and it's hard to see how much you're paying. This model is deeply opaque, and that lack of transparency has allowed consumers to end up paying just as much, if not more, for their finance. There's been a fantastic study done on the cost of finance for non-financial sector, so average consumers. What is the cost for them borrowing money, raising a debt, raising an equity? And Thomas Philippon did this work, and he found that in 1880, the cost was about 2% of every unit of finance. It cost about 2%. And last year, the cost was 2%. So in other words, all the innovation we've had since the steam age has not gone to lower costs to ordinary consumers. All of that innovation has actually gone to the profits for the financial sector. So this opaqueness has allowed monopolistic type profits, and the consumers have suffered. The consumers have not gained the benefits of innovation, of technology, of the way the whole world has advanced over time. And the second deep problem is that we've moved to a model where we used to have banks with balance sheets, the ability to absorb risks if things go wrong. And we've moved to a model where everyone is not an absorber of risk, they're a shuffler of risk. Their strategy, if things go wrong, is to sell it to someone else first. And that model looks okay when times are good, but it falls apart when times are bad, when everybody is trying to sell it to somebody else at the time of crisis. And we've in fact seen an increase of volatility, an increase of flash crashes, for example, because the strategy of too much of our financial sector is not to absorb risks, but to sell them first. And when we see volatility in the markets heading down, the strategy of the high-frequency trader, they can't absorb that risk. They don't have the capital for it. They're unregulated, uncapitalized institutions. They can't absorb the risk. Their only strategy is to try and have the technology that will sell before other people sell. That drains liquidity in the financial sector. That saps the ability of the financial sector to absorb risks. That creates fragility. And that's the problem that we have. And that's why this financial transaction tax, I think one of the most important aspects of it, we talk a lot about revenues, and I'll come to that in a moment. I think the most important point of it is that we shift our financial sector to something that is more stable, more focused on long-term investing, and more fit for purpose for investing in what finance should be about. Now, I mentioned that we have a financial transaction tax, a UK stamp duty. So how come We've got this tax, but we still have all these problems in finance we've talked about just now. Well, it's partly because the industry has been so much against this tax, so they have persuaded successive governments to neglect the tax. It has not been modernized for 30 years. So whilst the financial sector is moving and developing and innovating every year, this tax has been frozen still. And one example of the problems has been the market maker exemption. So 20 years ago, market making was about 10 to 15% of the marketplace, and it felt we should exempt market makers because they were providing liquidity to the marketplace. Today, the people who classify themselves as market makers are around 60% of daily trading in the markets. And this abuse means high-frequency traders, hedge funds and others calling themselves market makers but not really doing the activity of a market maker, not standing ready to buy or sell irrespective of market conditions. They're actually players in the market, and they are encouraging these trends and the flash crashes that we've talked about. So we need to remove the market maker exemption. We need to say that for market makers and people we can prove are market makers, you will have a reduced tax. It'll be 0.2%, not 0.5%, but you will still pay something. And that will help to eliminate some of the very high-frequency trading that goes on and rebalancing our markets. It will also raise a further £1 billion to the Treasury. The other thing that we need to do is to think about another distortion. So when this tax was developed, we didn't really have bond markets. We only had equity markets. And one of the challenges of our financial and our tax system is that we favor debt over equity. We give debt players tax exemptions whilst we tax equity. So to make this tax fairer, we need to not only tax equity transactions, but debt transactions as well. Corporate bond transactions, credit instruments as well. And that will raise another £1.2 billion in really essentially leveling the playing field. So both debt and equity are facing similar transaction fees. And then we can do something else too. The final thing we propose to do is to tax derivatives. Now let me give you one explanation for why this is now possible today, but would not have been possible about 20 years ago. Because 20 years ago, we didn't have much advance on beneficial ownership information. Today, I don't know how many of you tried to open a new bank account or building society account recently. It is hell. You have to fill out forms, you've got to get your ID, you've got to make sure you've got your past address for the last 3 months from a utility bill. 20 years ago, you could turn up somewhere and open an account showing no information about yourself. That is no longer possible. In fact, some 90 countries have now signed the OECD's multilateral taxation exchange of information agreements. So in this environment, if someone were to say, well, I'm going to buy a derivative, but not from the UK, I'm going to set up a company somewhere else, today we know who the beneficial owner of that company is. And that's the way we can follow what they're doing and pay taxes. In the same way that you and I would pay tax if we bought a share in Hong Kong, because we're still liable for income tax and capital gains tax, buying it in Hong Kong. If a British company were to create a subsidiary, we would know the beneficial ownership of that subsidiary and that tax would be paid. So including derivatives, credit derivatives, equity derivatives, adds another £2.5 billion to the tax take per year. Now let me say, and let me end with a few words on how have we come up with these estimates. Because we've done a very conservative exercise. The way you come up with revenue estimates is you need to look at the tax rate and multiply the tax rate by the post-tax turnover. We accept, it's a basic principle of this analysis, that having the tax will change people's behavior. You can't compare the current tax rate with the turnover before you had the tax. In fact, if we were to do that, ladies and gentlemen, we'd be telling you that we can raise 65 billion pounds over the course of 5 years, not 25 billion pounds. That difference is we're making very conservative assumptions on changes of behavior as you raise taxes on transactions. And the first thing you need to do is look at the estimate of how much does raising a tax change behavior. And this is called, in the economics jargon, the elasticity. How much does demand go down as you raise the cost of that transaction? And there are plenty of studies on elasticities, and they estimate that the average, in fact, is 1. And that's a very convenient number. What that means is a 10% increase in costs leads to a 10% reduction of turnover. Now, if we use that number of 1, based on the existing studies and that average, we'd be raising a lot more money than the 25 billion pounds I've mentioned to you earlier. But we feel we need to be more conservative than that. Because that 1, that average, hides 2 different types of players. The long-term investor whose activity is unaffected by the tax, and the short-term player whose activity is greatly affected by the tax. So we make a further conservative assumption. We say that 90% of all the turnover is by people who are hypersensitive to tax rates. And their elasticity isn't 1, it's 1.6. It's almost double. And only 10% of the turnover is by people for who their elasticities are very low. And when we do that, when we take these conservative estimates of elasticities, conservative estimates of transaction costs, and one line about transaction costs. So the industry has this view that whenever money goes to the government, that is evil, and whenever money goes to a private corporation, that is good. But in fact, in terms of the behavior of the market, it doesn't matter who is charging the higher cost. Higher costs change demand. And so we have to look at total costs. And the industry sometimes likes to say, well, transaction costs are tiny. Bid-ask spreads are tiny. And they conveniently have forgotten that there are clearing charges for transacting. There are settlement charges. There are exchange charges. There are brokerage charges. There are transaction-related research charges. And if you were to add up all of these charges, pension funds are paying between 0.5% to 1% every year already on transaction costs. So you take into account real transaction costs and a conservative estimate of elasticities is how we get to our numbers of raising an additional 4.7 billion pounds a year at about 25 billion pounds over the course of a 5-year period. Let me end there and welcome some questions from you, and just really conclude by saying that the financial transaction tax is a tax that is in existence today, does not require global agreement, that there are already over 20 countries that have it. They're already raising $30 billion per year using this tax. That this tax will not lead to a relocation of trades. Because if you relocate your trade and you still want to have legal enforceability, you will pay that tax. And this tax will also bring tremendous and important and vital stability, balance back to the marketplace. I'm not saying there should be no short-term trading in financial markets. I'm saying there's a balance between long-term and short-term. We need the short-term to discover prices, but we don't need the entire gamut to be short-term. We need long-term investing, and this tax will bring better balance between the short-term and the long-term, better stability. If it wasn't that a certain leader has impoverished the words strong and stable, I would say this tax will bring you greater strength and stability to our financial markets. And let me end by saying, in a post-Brexit environment, we need greater competitiveness for our industry. And if you ask the Germans, who are the most competitive European country today, what is a source? You ask the German companies, what is your biggest source of competitiveness? They will say long-term finance. If we want to have a competitive industry in a post-Brexit environment, we need different kind of finance. We need long-term finance that supports our industry and is fit for purpose. Thank you very much indeed.
you very much indeed, Avinash, for what was a very emphatic and thorough exposition, I think, of a fascinating proposal, which perhaps isn't as new as all that on the basis of what you were saying. We've got a lot of time for discussion now. We've got about half an hour. So is there anybody who would like to ask questions? And if you keep your hand up, I'll take a note of who's put their hand up. Yeah, good, thank you.
Salman Shaheen, Managing Editor of International Tax Review magazine. I spoke to Richard Murphy about the FTT. I believe he's had some influence on Labour's tax policy over the years. I mean, his view of it is that a properly designed FTT would not raise significant sums of revenue because it would be set at a rate that would constrain high-frequency trading and bring greater stability. And I mean, personally, on the tax side of things, I'm much like Boris Johnson. I'm pro-having and pro-eating when it comes to cake. But if you had to choose one of the two, I mean, what would you go for?
Well, I would say we've already done that. So if we were trying to get, so we assume no revenues from high-frequency trading. We assume no revenues from high-frequency trading. We assume that this tax will mean that that business will have to change. And so that is why we get to a £25 billion over 5 years and not a £65 billion revenue, which will be on the assumption that all the existing business is still there, despite your taxes, and you're raising revenues from everyone. So I think what we've done is we've gone to that balance. The balance between changing behavior in a positive way, encouraging more longer-term investing, more longer-term finance, slow finance rather than fast finance, but also at a level that raises revenues. And indeed, we've had the great advantage of having the example of the existing stamp duty. And the existing stamp duty at 0.5% doesn't really curb behavior enough, partly because of the exemptions, but clearly because the rate isn't so biting. And we're not arguing to raise that rate too much. We're arguing to make it more biting by removing these exemptions.
And the lady in the front row.
Stephanie Griffith-Jones.
I think you've been given a...
Sorry. Yes, Stephanie Griffith-Jones. Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant presentation, as usual, Avinash. I think one area that could be maybe stressed more, complementary to all what you've said, is the positive impact on growth. Because part of the narrative of those who are against the tax, they say it's going to damage growth. But in fact, we know that it will actually stimulate growth. And one channel is that it will make financial crisis less likely. And precisely for the kind of reasons that you gave, and if you think that typical financial crisis is at least 7-9% of fall of GDP, and if it only makes a decline of 5%, you will have actually almost 0.5% of more growth. But then if you think about how the money will be used, our future Chancellor will know that better. If for example, you replace the FTT by replaces another tax, which is less progressive, you will have the money taken from people who are very rich and pumped into the economy to people who will actually spend it. So you'll have a multiplier effect. If, for example, it goes into a British investment bank to capitalize it, then it can even have more leverage. So it could have actually a massive potential for growth. And I think it's important because the criticism comes possibly also partly from that side.
Well, let me begin by saying thank you very much, Stephanie, for coming. I don't know how many of you know that Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones is one of the pioneers in financial academia, so it's a great pleasure to have her here. And I think there are two aspects to the growth. One is, some studies are done on, a lot of traditional studies on tax, is looking at the impact of the tax. If you implement the tax and then dig a hole and you put all the money you raise into the hole. And the reason why they do that is because they don't want to then look at the impact of the variety of different ways you could spend that tax. Just focus on the aspect of the tax itself. But of course, you could spend that, you're not going to put it in a hole, you're going to spend that money on things. And if we spent it on infrastructure, if we spent it on schools and hospitals, if we spent it on apprenticeships, there are many things that will support growth. If we spent it on safer council houses, it would support growth. But there's another point which I think you're also hinting at, which is that the financial crisis cost us around $3 trillion. $3 trillion. And that is a conservative estimate. That's if you add up all the money lost, but also some of the economic costs, but not the opportunity costs. So $3 trillion. If this tax, which I believe it will only to reduce the scale or frequency of financial crashes by 2 percentage points, it would pay for itself completely without you spending the money on anything at all. So it has two sources of benefit. One is you've raised revenues that could be spent on things, and two, you have discouraged and disincentivized behavior that contributes, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but contributes to financial crashes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Hamish Sanderson. I'm the chair of Labour Business, which is the party's business organisation affiliated to Labour. We worked with the Treasury team on the manifesto, and we were very proud to support it. Our members in business, contrary to myth, also supported it, including the financial transactions tax. And there's a question I wanted to ask you about that. Just in terms of the explanation and the defense of it, you gave a very important historical perspective. I'm a solicitor, and I also like to give a perspective, which is that anyone who's bought or sold a house has paid stamp duty. So it's not the exotic foreign creation that some people would have us believe. But I guess the question is around a concern we have about tax avoidance and tax evasion. You didn't mention that specifically in your remarks. And I know that John McDonnell has done a lot of work, and the manifesto reflected this, to beef up HMRC enforcement and so on, and to take a much tougher line on avoidance and evasion. But nonetheless, there is a concern that a financial transactions tax might be particularly at risk of avoidance and evasion. What do you say to those of us who are concerned about that?
It's a very important question, and we have designed the tax specifically to deal with this issue. Maybe earlier designs would have been more vulnerable to relocation. It may have appeared to offer more revenues, but would have been more vulnerable to relocation. So we have deliberately chosen a design that makes relocation very, very hard. So today, if you are an American investor buying a French security in London, you do not pay the tax. And under our proposal, you will not pay the tax because you are not a UK tax resident and you're not trading a UK security. And so that business will not leave the City of London. And a large amount of their business is that business. So the international City of London remains there. Now imagine you are a British tax resident and you decide to trade your British security somewhere else. You will still have to pay the tax. Otherwise, if it's not stamped that tax is paid, it's not legally enforceable that you own it. Now imagine you're a British tax resident and you're buying non-British securities. And you're doing it through a different venue. Then the issue is, do we have the beneficial ownership information? And 20 years ago, we did not have. So were you to go to Hong Kong, and 20 years ago you might have claimed you would not have to provide information, you were a British tax resident. Today you have to. You cannot open that account. You cannot do that trade. And were you to do that, the Americans have developed this thing called FATCA, foreign account taxation, which means that the institution which opened the account for you is liable to a very big fine if they've not provided that information. Now, the financial sector has paid £300 billion of fines since 2008. So one of the things that's happening is that we're actually having enforcement. Before, we didn't have very good laws and we had no enforcement. Now we've got tougher laws and tougher enforcement. It's sad that enforcement hasn't really come as a result of a concern about tax. It's come because of a concern about countering financial terrorism and anti-money laundering. It's an inverse of the way that Al Capone was caught, right? Al Capone was a mafia boss and he was caught through tax evasion. Now we're catching tax evaders via anti-money laundering and criminal activity, because both those activities are clearly related. So I think that we are pretty confident that in today's world, there's going to be very limited relocation or avoidance potential.
Asker Shibani, I'm CEO of a company called Contact Network Systems. I'm an entrepreneur. I started my business for £50. I've grown it to international level, and I'm also an active member of Labour Party. What I'm interested in is entrepreneurship. How effective quality taxation can help entrepreneurship, and how it can help research and development. For growth of the country, and we need community-based entrepreneurs who care about their community, who wants to do something for their own region and their area. Unlike the external investors, they come in and they go out. And how the taxation can actually help people like us or others. Thank you.
Well, I think the answer to your question is twofold. Firstly, one of the challenges we have in the British financial system is that the financial sector makes a lot of money from short-term trading. So it becomes distracting. I remember when I was a city banker, we would have a hedge fund who turns over the entire portfolio every 3 months. And we'd have CalPERS, the biggest public pension fund in the world, who turns over their portfolio once every 5 years. We made a lot more commissions by trading with that small hedge fund than trading with CalPERS. And so CalPERS did not get our ideas, our innovative trading ideas or research, they all went to the hedge fund. So one of the things we need to do is change the incentives of the sector to make it less, to favor longer term investing over shorter term, to rebalance that. But I think that your point really looks for something else as well, because we have missing markets in finance. Banks are not going to ever provide you with the kind of funding you need because banks are not risky lenders. They're collateralized lenders. They want to know that if you go belly up, what have I got to sell to bring back my loan? And the nature of entrepreneurs, startups, is they haven't got collateral. It's the nature of it. You know, the collateral is to come when the business works. And so we have missing markets of finance. And I think one of the things we need to do is look at how we can develop those. More equity type, more crowdfunding. And there are a number of ways in which government does not have to provide the money, but can facilitate institutions that will get equity type capital to entrepreneurs.
Gentleman with the red tie.
Thank you. Jan Eager from Thomson Reuters, but not a journalist, just to clarify that, in government affairs. I've got a number of questions, and I'm afraid to say I haven't actually seen the proposal. I don't know if that's available and to take a look at the numbers also, but is there some sort of impact assessment on that has been commissioned already? Because if I remember correctly, the EU FTT impact assessment estimated that GDP would fall between 1.6 to 0.53%. I'd be interested to see how that would play out, in particular in conjunction with the effect of Brexit on the financial services industry here. My second question.
Can I take that question? Because that's a very important question. And I mean, I'm in danger of forgetting all the questions, but let's take that question. It's a very important question. So there was an EU survey which did, and they came up with a number of about 1.5% of GDP loss. Now, they then revised that number down to 0.2%. Is that correct, Stephanie? I know you've looked at this. So they revised the number down to 0.2%. Now, there are two assumptions that this 0.2% made. So they said that the economy would contract by 0.2%. The first assumption was they said that all investment was being done by the equity, but by the tax security. But in actual fact, only 15% of investment is done by securities. 85% of investment is done by retained earnings of companies, which would not be taxed. And the second thing this survey did is they assumed that they dug a hole and they put all the revenues in the hole and they didn't spend any of the money. Now, that I would say is not a realistic assumption. And the third thing they didn't do is look at what is the likelihood of the impact on reducing financial crises. And if you were to add all those three things together, I know Stephanie has done some work on this, you would end up with a positive GDP impact.
May I follow up with some other questions? Is there also going to be some alignment to the EU proposal? Because from what I understand from your earlier statements, you propose a 0.2% tax on financial services firms. And that is, well, you could say significantly higher than what's in the EU FTT. In particular, if this FTT would also impact derivatives transactions. So I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate on that. In particular, whether the derivatives transactions would also would be tax nominal, and then do you expect the tax to apply to forex and forex swaps, or what about the spot market?
Okay, so the European FTT is a tax on both buying and selling. So they have a 0.1% tax, but if you do the buying and selling together, it's 0.2%. So in fact, that rate is the same as our proposal for financial intermediaries of 0.2%. We have a tax of 0.5% for non-financial intermediaries, so we have a higher tax rate than the European rate. Now, that's partly because we have a history and experience of running a higher tax rate and finding that has raised a lot of revenues. Now, on derivatives, so the European tax is a lower tax, and they're still in discussions about what the actual rate will be for derivatives, but they're talking about maybe 1 basis point for derivatives. But they're using the face value of derivatives. We believe that what's more important is the economic value of derivatives, the cash flow actually related to a derivative, and that will be economically fairer than using the face value. And we say that using the economic value, you can apply the same tax rates. The economic value of a derivative is often much smaller than its face value.
Okay, thank you. I've got the gentleman in the yellow jacket kind of halfway down. Thank you.
Thank you. Raj Moss from Preventable Surprises. Avinash, a great, confident presentation. My question really relates to your point about long-term investing, which is clearly a really major need. John Kay talked about it. We haven't had much movement since, and maybe this could be a trigger for that. One can understand why banks would not like this idea, and traders particularly. But I was quite shocked when I found that the pension funds are also quite angst about it. And I don't know whether that's still the case. And I just wondered whether you could explain why you think pension funds, who should be long-term investors, are actually quite anxious about this tax, and what you would say to them.
I think that there are two responses, Raj, and thank you for your question. The first one is that we have a slightly unhealthy relationship between asset managers and the bankers. The bankers get more commissions from high-frequency trading of the asset managers, and they favor those asset managers who do high-frequency trading. They favor them with not just information, research, football tickets, all kinds of things. And so you could see that relationship is going to be threatened by this tax. I think that's one unfortunate reason. I think the other key problem we have, Raj, though, in getting pension funds, and of course, let's prefix it as long-term pension funds, because there are some pension funds that are paying out rather than investing, so they're not long-term. But I would say the problem for long-term pension funds and life insurance companies is a set of new regulations called Solvency II, which treats them like banks and forces them to have more capital for their long-term investing. For investing in public equities or private equity, they need to have 49% capital if they invest in long-term private equity, the kind of thing which would finance infrastructure, and almost zero capital for investing in Greek government bonds, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so we need to change our regulation in a way that is appropriate from an economic, investment, and the members' perspective, members of these funds, by saying that the capital charge should relate to the riskiness, when the riskiness takes into account how long-term the fund is. So if the fund is a 25-year fund, they should think about risks over the 25 years, in which case infrastructure is a low risk. If it's a one-year fund, infrastructure is a high risk, and they should take that into account. I think that's really will be what will change the way our asset managers behave. And I think it's a very important point. When you and I were growing up maybe 20, 30 years ago, you would pass an empty plot of land and it would say, you know, a new building funded by Norwich Union Pension Fund. Today they don't do that because they've got to put up too much capital. And we need to get those long-term investors back. These are long-term savers. We need to get them back into long-term investing.
A gentleman in the second row with an orange tie.
Thanks. Phil McCauley from Labour Business. I enjoyed your presentation. If you want to incentivise long-term investment, why isn't the financial transaction tax tapered to be lower if you hold longer?
So the financial transaction tax is effectively a tax on churning. So if you are a pension fund that turns over your portfolio every 5 years, your tax rate is 1/5 of the tax rate on a yearly basis, right? Yeah. It's 0.5 divided by, you know, the 5 years you're taking. But if you're a hedge fund who turns over your entire portfolio every 3 months, 4 times a year, your tax rate is 4 times the 0.5%. So it has got a built-in taper where the more you churn, the more you're paying. And there may be some investments where that makes sense. And there's some investments that will not be able to bear that cost. And those investments won't take place. So I would say it's built in as favoring the long term.
Just one more question I wanted to ask, because it seems to me, I mean, you mentioned the 300 million that was paid to regulators. It seems to me that there's a big problem with the difference between civil and criminal law when it comes to behaviour. And we seem to all blithely accept that if banks and institutions fail and take what we would regard as criminal acts, actually they just get fined. And that's just a form of taxation. What do you think we need to propose around FTT to have proper criminal activity punished by law?
Well, I understand it's very well placed and understood anger that the public have and should have at the behavior that went on in the financial sector and why they want criminal. The problem is that because criminal law ends up putting people in jail, understandably, it has higher thresholds of evidence. And the nature of the banking industry, and we've seen this with the Grenfell corporate structure, is that the corporate structure is designed to make sure that no one actually has any individual responsibility. So it's very, very hard to use. If you applied criminal law, they'd all get away.
Oh, they'd all get in prison.
I think you're pretty sure that they would not all get in prison. So I would say one has to think about the fact that you want to stop this behavior, and what is the most effective way of actually doing it, other than the emotionally most satisfying way of doing it. Now, the other thing I think that is very important is the old adage in central banking used to be that we would save the banks but not the bankers. And we didn't do enough of that. We didn't do enough of saying that whilst we will support the banking industry, those people who were in charge and may have contributed to these problems cannot be in charge as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time. I'm going to take the 2 people who I've seen to be having their hands up consistently. I hope that's okay. So the lady in the blue top and then the gentleman in the second row. I'm sorry if people didn't have a chance to ask all their questions, but maybe you can have a quick chat with Avinash at the end. Thank you.
Hi there, Jemima Rowe from Clifford Chance. You have emphasised that this has been designed in a way that is not going to cause relocation out of London. But from the way that I see it, a trader that's sitting in London that is trading derivatives or foreign securities is going to be taxed, whereas someone doing the same in Dublin or Frankfurt won't be. So if you could possibly expand on that a little bit.
Well, if they're a UK tax resident, they will pay the tax whether they do the trade in the UK or whether they do the trade in Dublin. They don't escape the tax by moving the trade to Dublin. They don't escape the tax by moving the trade to Hong Kong. So now let's imagine they're in Ireland and they're trading a British security. They're paying the tax because it's a British security. They don't avoid the tax by doing that trade somewhere else. So the point is we are not taxing where the trade takes place. We're taxing who is trading and what they're trading. And those two things they cannot avoid. If they're non-British, trading non-UK securities, they don't pay the tax. And if they're doing activity in the UK, they'll continue doing it. But if they're British, they're paying the tax wherever they trade. And if they are trading a British security, doesn't matter where they trade, they're paying the tax. And today, that's why we've got this amazing number that 50% of the people who pay stamp duty, so $1.8 billion of stamp duty is paid by non-Brits because they've got a UK security and they want to make sure that no one can challenge their ownership of that security.
Last question.
My name is Ian Young from the Institute of Chartered Accountants, England and Wales, and I want to take you back just 10 years, not to 1624, and my chief executive and several of the people in the room were part of a leading group of experts from the UN to look at the way in which you could arrive at a global means of innovative financing for, in fact, that was the task, was to pay for development and fight climate change. And you had 4 criteria. One was the sufficiency, you had to make enough money. Another was the impact on the markets. Another was feasibility. And the fourth was sustainability and suitability. And the one that you came up with was a tax on currency transactions, because there is one bank in the United States, Continuous Link Settlement Bank, through which the majority of foreign exchange transactions are transacted. And they do have a very small percentage that they take out of each transaction to pay for the cost of the organization, which is about, from memory, $50 million, so not a great deal of money. So you were intending to get more money. But the currency transaction tax was the one that you and Stephanie and others came up with as the one that made most sense in a global context, to not distort individual marketplaces, but to be a tax which would pay for the things you wanted to pay for without unduly affecting the marketplaces in the world. So I'd just like you to sort of cast your mind back and say, if you were now, looking from today's perspective, is a currency transactions tax still a feasible option? Is that a better option than the FTT that you're proposing?
I think that a currency transaction tax has many merits. And I think that one of the things, and one of the reasons 10 years ago was we had, in the 1990s, was a period of great currency crises. And we were very concerned that these crises were self-feeding. The speculation fed speculation. And that how would we act as a breaker into that system? And maybe a transaction tax would be one idea. Indeed, James Tobin's original idea was on currency transactions. I think our view is, though, that we have to, if we're concerned about relocation, and if we're concerned about making sure that the tax cannot be easily avoided and is easy to collect, it is a tougher tax than the one being proposed today. And that is why, if you like, we've made that compromise for the purpose of making sure that it's something which you will not be able to relocate out of. It's not to say that it's not a bad idea. It's not to say it's not an idea that should be revisited and people should pursue it, but it may be easier today with existing structures of relocating and avoiding it than the security transactions.
Thank you very much indeed. And we're almost at 3 o'clock now. I have to say, initially we'd thought we'd only have 5 or 6 questions because they might get repetitive. I have to say they certainly haven't been. I think they've been very, very thoughtful, very stimulating and very interesting. They've certainly given us in the Treasury team, Shadow Treasury team, a lot of food for thought, as have, of course, Avinash's very, very interesting and stimulating thoughts. Big thanks to everybody who has been here today, and of course, particularly to Labour Business as well. We really appreciate, as a Shadow Treasury team, all of their thoughtful suggestions and input into our economic decision making. I think this is just the start, actually, of a more wide-ranging discussion around this topic, but I'm sure many other issues concerning city regulation, other aspects of taxation as well into the future. So thank you very much again all for being here, and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Thank you. Thank you.